Hi, everybody. Can you all hear me? Yeah. So I'm Jocelyn Kaiser. I'm a science writer like all of you. I work at Science Magazine. I write for the front section, the news section, and I cover both research and policy. So I write about things like the NIH budget. And I want to start out today, since we're talking about funding, as a lot of you probably know, there was big news today, and that is that Congress has approved a bill that will give NIH a $2 billion increase next year. And that came after the Trump administration wanted to cut NIH's budget by $1 billion this year. So that's very good news for cancer research. And maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more later. As you probably know, it's not over because there could be more cuts next year. So I was going to start out just by saying a few words about our speakers, and then I'll ask them a question that lets them say a little bit more about what they do. So first, Drew Pardol. I don't know if you guys have talked to him, but if you've covered immunotherapy at all, chances are you've talked to him because he's been one of the central researchers with developing checkpoint inhibitors, the PD-1 inhibitors. And so, he's always on your list of people to get comment on whatever. And so he can talk a little bit more about that. Elad Sharon is at the National Cancer Institute, and he is a senior investigator with it's called the Cancer Therapy Evaluation Program. He works with academic industry collaborators on clinical development of new therapies, including immunotherapies. And if you're interested in the NCI, if you have questions about the moonshot, the Biden moonshot, he is also heading the immunotherapy part of that for adult cancers, right? So, and then Scott Karmer has pointed out he's the one person on the agenda today who is from industry, so you can direct your questions to him. He's ready for them. He's with Neximmune, which is a biotech. He's a COO, Chief Operating Officer of a biotech developing another new type of immunotherapy. It's not CAR T cells, it's something else involving some sort of cells. And he's not a scientist, but he's worked for a lot of companies like AstraZeneca and Amgen, and so he's glad to take your questions from that perspective. So for the first question, I was just going to ask if everyone could just speak very briefly for a couple minutes about what your institution is doing to invest in immunotherapy research.
So I've been doing cancer immunology and immunotherapy for 29 years. It's the only job I've had at Hopkins. Hopkins has been great, even in the days when everybody was very skeptical about it and really thought it wasn't going to go anywhere. Our institution supported us, but last year we were able to launch an institute called the Bloomberg Kimmel Institute for Cancer Immunotherapy. At Hopkins, we're very much associated with the Kimmel Cancer Center. Mike Bloomberg and Sidney Kimmel each put in $50 million and raised a few more dollars to add to that. So this has been, in many ways, for our ability to really propel things into the future, the transformative event.
Okay. Elad?
So I think I'm also the only government person who's been on the panels today. So I feel your pain. I work at CTEP, which is actually the arm of the National Cancer Institute that sponsors a great many clinical trials. We have about 900 clinical trials that we either sponsor or somehow manage across the U.S., some of them in the intramural program at the NCI, and many of them at great institutions like Johns Hopkins, in which we provide some clinical trial support, help a little bit with design and things of that nature, and also try to advance translational research and all sorts of ancillary aspects of clinical trial work. I have been there for about 5 years. I was previously in the intramural program of the National Cancer Institute, actually where I think Dr. Pardol worked at some point, along with Dr. Suzanne Topalian, who happens to also be married to Dr. Pardol, and sort of initiated some of the excitement in the oncology community with her presentation at ASCO in 2012 regarding responses to nivolumab in patients with lung cancer specifically. I think they were excited already enough, but it helped to have a non-immunogenic tumor respond. Just like Jocelyn mentioned, I've been involved also with the Cancer Moonshot. I'm not leading the entire effort, I'm co-chairing the adult immunotherapy aspect of, or implementation team for Cancer Moonshot, in which we're basically trying to take the Blue Ribbon Panel recommendations that involved a number of very high profile and important investigators from around the country, making recommendations to the National Cancer Institute as to how we might be able to better implement and advance cancer therapy so that we can make 10 years worth of progress in 5 years. So that's basically where I'm starting.
So hello, I'm Scott Carmer, and earlier this morning we had the snot guy, right? And I'm now the industry guy, but maybe even worse than that, I'm the commercial guy from industry. But I've spent my career working at companies like Amgen and Genentech and MedImmune, and primarily my role has been basically twofold. Half the time I was afforded the privilege to work with some of the best scientists in the world, thinking about how we develop and commercialize technologies and products in a way that the biology would define a market instead of a market defining the biology. And then I got to spend the second half of my time, thinking about how we would value those assets, price those assets, introduce them to the market, and then haggle with insurers about making sure we got reimbursement for those products. I took an exit from the big industry to join the very small industry. So I went from leading an organization of 7,000 people to now I work with 7 at a spin out from Dr. Schneck's lab. He was talking this morning about the nanoparticle antigen presenting cells, and we're developing a cellular therapy that is antigen specific and how we remove and educate those T cells and then reintroduce them to patients with cancer.
Okay. So I'm going to ask just one quick question. Now, when I've interviewed people in this field over the last few years, sometimes when I talk to people like Drew, I get the impression that for a long time people felt like NCI was just not interested in funding this area because it hadn't really worked. And I'm just wondering if you feel like that's changed. I mean, now people are putting a lot of money into it, or do you still feel like targeted, we're sequencing more tumors and they're still fixated on targeted therapies?
Yeah. Well, I think we can always take criticism. I would say actually that the intramural program at the NCI has basically kept this field alive for probably the past 20 to 30 years, and I think that's probably something that Drew would agree with as well. The surgery branch at the NCI, particularly Steve Rosenberg and some others, have actually created a lot of the theoretical underpinnings behind how immunotherapy really works, or how it's worked up till now. And it's something that probably I'm just repeating something that he said in the past, but the T cell has really been the workhorse or the final common pathway as to how immunotherapy has actually affected its response. And a lot of that work was really done in the intramural program at the NCI, starting really about 30 to 40 years ago at this point. Obviously, there's a lot of work that can and probably should be done, and at least from my perspective, I've been working on immunotherapy since I got to CTAP, so I mean, I feel like we've done a lot, but I've only been there for 5 years. What I can say is that the extramural grant pool is actually kind of a big ship, and to a certain extent or to a certain degree, making a ship like that change direction is a little bit difficult. And so I at least personally feel that the Blue Ribbon Panel and the Cancer Moonshot effort, which has already been partially funded, we have $300 million worth of funding that was given to the NCI in FY 2017 by Congress with the passage of the 21st Century Cures Act in December 2016, that already I feel that there's a lot more movement in that direction. And there probably needs to be a lot more done. Again, from my perspective, Cancer Moonshot has sort of allowed us to have the door opened in discussions with sister institutes at the NCI, other groups around the country that have really been focusing on immunotherapy to a greater extent probably than the NCI has, at least from the perspective of the lymphocyte biology and other aspects. So there's a lot more that can be done, a lot that I feel that we can learn from NIAID, which is the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Disease, and other aspects of the NIH and other partners like Drew and the Parker Institute for Cancer Immunotherapy. We learn a lot actually from industry as well. And so I actually feel that there's a lot that we can and should be doing, and I always want us to do more. So.
Yeah. Drew, do you want to say anything about?
Yeah, so having lived my life in the extramural world, I have a slightly less intramural NCI-centric view of life. I think to add what Elad said, the real explosion in immunotherapy is very recent. Ipilimumab, the anti-CTLA-4, was FDA approved in 2011, and then Elad mentioned Suzanne's presentation at American Society of Clinical Oncology, which coincided with the New England Journal paper in 2012, was a sort of explosion. And I sort of, in thinking back to an analogy there in terms of the speed at which really one agent transformed a field, I liken PD-1 to, at the risk of hyperbole, to penicillin, where you had really one agent or a class of agents that now cut across currently 7 cancer types. It's approved for, in this incredibly short period of time, 2 years from today, there'll be between 5 and 7 additional cancers: liver cancer, gastric cancer, esophageal cancer, probably small cell cancer of the lung, others. When I was a resident, penicillin at that point was a small part of a much larger armamentarium. There are currently about 80 immunotherapies. There are over 1,000 clinical trials combining 2 or more immunotherapies. Soon it's going to be 3. And so the oncology world really was not ready for this. This is a completely different kind of therapy. And while it's still only about 15 to 20%, if you take all patients, in those 15 to 20%, we do measure the durability of the response in years, not in months. So we can offer, in a lot of the cancer types, some real hope to a percent of patients that they will live for many years and hopefully die of something other than their cancer. We all have to die of something, but hopefully it's not their cancer. The NCI extramural world is very different from the intramural program. In 2012, when the rest of the oncology, of the clinical oncology world was falling in love with immunotherapy, in 2013, Jonathan last session mentioned breakthrough of the year, when the cancer research world fell in love with it. At the recent American Association for Cancer Research meetings, I think, I don't know, a third, a half of the sessions were related to cancer immunology. So Jonathan Simons, who's head of the Prostate Cancer Foundation, did a formal analysis in 2012 of the proportion of NCI funding that went to cancer immunology and immunotherapy, and that number was 3%. 3%. There is no question that the leadership of the NCI was completely focused on oncogene-targeted therapy. Harold Varmus is a brilliant guy, but his career, his Nobel Prize, was discovering oncogenes, so that's what he was focused on. And the reality is that it did absolutely crowd out funding that the field of cancer immunology and immunotherapy deserved. The good news is that that is now changing. They've been behind the curve, but they are catching up to the curve. Elad's been one of the key people that's helped that happen. So we're very excited that it's changing. In the meantime, because foundations discovered the importance of immunotherapy a long time ago, now in 2011, 2012, biotech and pharma are all in. I was quoted in the Wall Street Journal a year or two ago saying these days there are two kinds of pharma. There's the pharma that's into immunotherapy up to their eyeballs and the ones that want to be. So this has brought in now massive investment, and which is fantastic because that is driving the field. I think the importance, though, of independent funding in the academic world is really important, going back to Young Lee's discussion of these MSI, these mismatch repair defective cancers. I mean, this came out of a brainstorming session in which the world of cancer immunology went on its first date with the world of cancer genetics, and it was love at first sight. It took, and out of that really came this, it was truly a eureka moment, the notion that PD-1 pathway blockade should be incredibly effective for this genetically defined subset of cancers. It took a year to ultimately get, because it sounded crazy at the time, to get a pharmaceutical company to be willing to give us, and we thank Merck for that, who gave us pembrolizumab, but they said, you know, we've got so much on our plate, you guys have to pay for the trial. So fortunately, Bert Vogelstein, who was one of the discoverers of the genes responsible for this cancer type, had some independent funding, and he said, fine, we'll pay for it. So I think having that kind of independent funding in parallel with pharmaceutical and biotech investment, I think is all really important in capturing as much of the remaining 80% as possible. I believe we can capture the majority of the 80% that we have not yet captured, in the same way that penicillin captured 20 or 30% of bacterial infections. When I was a resident, we had an antibiotic for 95%.
Okay, I'm going to just ask one or two more questions because I want you guys to get a chance to ask your questions. But here's one maybe for you. What about academic industry, public-private partnerships? What can they tackle that they couldn't do on their own? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I like your comment about industry. There's the people that are in it and people that want. I think that there's the first movers, the fast followers, and the late adopters. Ultimately, the late adopters will get there. But I think that there's so much that can be done in industry academic collaborations. The thing about when you start a company, you have to have investors, right? And investors want to know exactly what they're going to get for their money that they invest. And so they'll want to know how are you going to break down exactly, how are you going to use their investment. Use of proceeds is what they call it. And then from there, that's your contract with them. And they want you exquisitely focused just on that. Well, the thing about when you get into an area like biology and the immunotherapies, the technology really represents a platform, not just a specific application. And so a lot of times, for early companies especially, investors don't want you to think about a platform. They want you to think about a specific application. So in the instance of the technology that we're working on, the nanoparticle APCs, Jonathan talked this morning about it can be used in infectious disease, they can be used in autoimmune disease, and they can be used in immuno-oncology. Well, the company can't focus, it can't pursue research against the entire platform. We can pick one of those elements and then focus all of our resource on that, which leaves the rest of the platform open. And that's where we really reach out to academia to help us with that kind of research. And we can structure strategic research agreements. We can have material transfer agreements. But academia does research so much better than a small company can. And so there's significant areas for collaboration. And it doesn't have to be exclusive. As a small company, we can partner with Johns Hopkins, we can partner with Memorial Sloan, we can partner with MD Anderson. But each is a very specific area that we're interested in, but we just don't have the resource, the financials or the people to pursue it.
Right. So I'm going to open up to questions now. I have more, but let's see if some of our audience. And Scott said he's happy to take your questions about pricing if you want to ask them.
I guess thinking about those collaborations between academia and companies, and even some larger companies now try and outsource their R&D, basically, dangling this funding above, university labs, saying, here, we'll toss you some money. What are the motivations there and for people to stay in academia and do that instead of just jumping over to the commercial side? And I guess, does it get complicated with IP and ownership? I know obviously you have these agreements, but at the end of the day, there are people that spend 30 years at a university lab working towards something, but then how much are they really a part of that? I know that's kind of an open-ended question, but to me these collaborations seem very complicated. Sorry.
I see my partner laughing in the back. So let me take one piece of that at a time. I think that industry, the companies that are in our industry have to decide what business they're in. You can be fully integrated and think about you're going to do research, you're going to do translational science, you're going to do drug development, and you're going to commercialize that in terms of sales and marketing. That's one business model, and that kind of company has a certain risk profile. And that will attract certain kind of investors. Mm-hmm. People that don't want to have that much risk, and they want to farm out R&D, farm out R, and keep D. That's completely de-risking a specific investment. And so I think the industry has to decide, what business am I in? And I used to work for a company that had a motto that went from the chairman to the CEO to, it didn't matter if you were in drug development or regulatory science or marketing or janitorial services. It was innovate or die. And I think that's something we should all be thinking about in terms of the business that we want to define ourselves as being in. And when we think about if we're going to choose the innovation business, then I think that drives you toward collaborations, right? Nobody has cornered the market on great ideas or innovation. And I think that encourages certain companies to reach out and find academic organizations that can help really pursue innovation. And I think that the relationships that you have, I think that those are, if you've written one contract, I think you've written one contract. I think it does get sticky around intellectual property. If you're working jointly on an idea, does the joint, you can have joint intellectual property, or you can have the inventor will take ownership of the intellectual property, or the company owns all intellectual property. So there are different options and different models. And I think that as researchers, I'll tell you, you should stand up for what you bring to the table, and intellectual property and how you structure a contract in terms of how that science and technology gets commercialized. You should share in the incentives as the technology goes all the way through toward commercialization into royalties on sales.
Thank you.
Just thought I should probably add, so a lot of this is actually probably managed by tech transfer offices at various universities. We also have outgrowths that emerge from clinical trials that we run in collaboration with industry. So we have collaborative research and development agreements, which we call CRADAs. And those CRADAs actually involve some aspect of non-exclusive licenses that are held not only by the companies that are actually providing some aspect of the intellectual property, but also the investigators that might help develop it further. So, I mean, I agree 100%. I think you need to develop those things a priori, and luckily, academia is not really just an investigator sitting out on an island. For the most part, universities are aware of this, and they try to take some sort of ownership over their intellectual property and hopefully also incentivize and protect their researchers.
Do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I'll simply say from the standpoint of drug development and all therapeutics development, I do think that cancer immunotherapy is changing the game in terms of the relationship between the academic investigator and pharma. Pharma, up until this, and certainly if you're just focusing on cancer, virtually all the therapies over the last half century, starting from Sidney Farber, were small molecule drugs targeted at the tumor. The targets and all would be discovered, some of the biology done in the academic institutions, and then pharma took over, and their attitude, which wasn't totally unreasonable, was we know how to make the drugs. We know how to do the screens. We've got big screening apparatus. We can do the medicinal chemistry. And there were formulas, then we need to do multi-center clinical trials. We'll organize those trials. All of a sudden comes immunotherapy where the treatments, most of them are not small molecule drugs. They're antibodies, they're cells, they're genetically engineered cells. And we're not, with our therapies, targeting the tumor anymore. We're targeting T cells to empower the patient's own immune system to attack their tumor. The biology of this, and therefore therapeutics development, is completely different than the conventional small molecule tumor-targeted drugs, including the oncogene-targeted drugs. So pharma has now realized that they help themselves a lot by availing themselves of all of the immunobiology that really is in the academic world. My first collaboration ever with pharma came one day when I woke up, and it turns out that the little biotech company that we were developing, originally MDX 1106, was now owned by BMS. It's now Opdivo. It took a while, but we have great collaborations with BMS, Merck, and so I think that really has gone a long ways to reestablishing academic pharma partnerships. Certainly it's always been easy with startups, I think, because a lot of the startups are oftentimes manned by our former postdocs and whatnot. But with pharma, that relationship really through this field has flourished for those reasons.
I agree.
Do we have any more questions from our audience?
So I'm just curious from the perspective of both industry and academia, what counts as success both clinically and commercially for you to want to advance for approval by FDA and go forward with it? Because I think some of the therapies, it's not like a sort of a broad spectrum chemo that would apply to so many patients. You have a very small N, if you will. How do you determine, that you have exhibited, that the therapy has exhibited enough success in enough patients that it's worthy, if you will, of being commercialized?
What was that?
I can at least discuss part of it. I think that the FDA has a variety of different incentives that they utilize to sort of get industry pushed in certain directions. So obviously there are different pathways, for instance, accelerated approval that might exist even if you don't necessarily have an overall survival advantage in a large clinical trial that you can potentially create. But one thing that does push industry a little bit, I think, is the orphan drug designation, or some of these rare breakthroughs designations, these attempts that the FDA has to try to take some smaller indications, like Merkel cell cancer, I think was a very good example. That's a disease that affects 1,600 patients a year. There is now one approved drug, avelumab, that was actually developed in a clinical trial exclusively focused on these really rare cancers. And pembrolizumab, which is a trial actually we ran with the University of Washington and had some participation also by Suzanne Topalian and Evan Lipson at Johns Hopkins, that led to pembrolizumab being included in the compendium for Merkel cell cancer by the NCCN, the National Comprehensive Cancer Network. So there are, the truth is the design overall is probably really important to trying to see that you have real patient benefit of anything that you're doing clinically. And that probably is the most important thing a priori anytime you're actually developing or creating a clinical trial, that you have firm endpoints so that you can really understand what patient benefit is. Certainly if you have a trial that actually potentially could lead to registration. I don't know if I'm getting in the right direction of where your question is, but
maybe I'll take a bite at it
Sure.
from industry. It's tough. It's a difficult question that you ask. And there are several different rounds of review in terms of governance committees, starting with the research review committee. It goes to an early development committee, which goes to a phase 3 commercialization committee. And this goes back to my earlier comment. I wasn't kind of being flippant. I think that you really, really have to make sure that you understand the science and the biology and where it can take you. Right? And the biology has to define a market. And I think that's the piece that's sometimes hardest for industry. You want to let the market say what the biology should be doing, and it just doesn't work that way. And that's a recipe for failure. And I think the most successful companies do this, their governance, in a very structured, in a very kind of, success is defined a priori. You don't get the data and then say, what do we think, right? You kind of have to define your go, no-go in terms of technical success, the efficacy, the benefit, the risk of an adverse event, so the risk profile, and you do have to think about commercialization and regulatory, the complexities, the manufacturing complexity, manufacturing costs. What's it going to cost to actually bring it to market? So it's a very fundamental question that you ask, and it's a difficult one to answer, but I think the companies that are successful have a very systematic way to address the question. And it's not just luck that brings a drug all the way successfully to market. And I do think there was a question earlier about pricing. That's a tough one too. And I'll tell you that this may be heresy to my industry colleagues, but we haven't done a good job. And the days of pricing a therapeutic based on what the market will bear have to be over. That can't continue. And I think that we have to think about, and by the way, the more innovative a drug is, the easier it is to develop, right? The fewer patients you need in a clinical trial, the less expensive it is to develop. And then it becomes a question around how do you define value? And I think that the industry has not done a great job of working with patients and with clinicians and with payers to first, let's characterize value, let's agree value, and then let's figure out how we're going to quantify value. And by the way, we can be a little more transparent in how we do that. And I think that as we get into immunotherapies, and certainly as cell-based therapies come through the market, I was just reading an article Friday, there's now 3 drugs that are approved that with annual costs of over $700,000. Who can pay, a 20% copay for a drug that costs $700,000? You can't do it. So there's a two-way dialogue that has to happen. All right? I'm saying industry needs to step up and be more transparent and a little more thorough in how we kind of quantitate value. And then that'll set a pricing, right, a point. The problem is not just pricing, it's reimbursement, right? We're stuck in this unit of use reimbursement, right? So whatever you charge, I'm going to have to reimburse at the time that I receive, right, the bill for that payment. That works fine if you have a chronic therapy, and every month you get your prescription renewed, and every month you have a $5 copay. But for therapies that are potentially curative with a single administration, and it's a $700,000 price tag, our current reimbursement system doesn't allow for accrual of benefit over time. So that needs to change, and that's actually a difficult discussion that has to take place with Congress, believe it or not, because Congress sets the reimbursement system for Medicare, for the federal system, and for Medicaid, right? And commercial insurers are so fragmented that one commercial insurer doesn't have a large enough population to try a brand new pricing and reimbursement scheme. So as we think about curative therapies, we need to think about new reimbursement mechanisms in addition to more transparency around how we price them. That was a really kind of long-winded response, but there is a systematic way to address the question that you asked. And the answers need to be identified a priori before you actually get the data.
I'm sorry, to follow up on this, Arthur Allen from Politico. I was just wondering, I don't cover this area real closely, but is the complexity of monoclonal antibodies, which seem to be right now the focus with immunotherapy, are there IP issues that keep the prices up? In other words, that make it hard for, I mean, if every pharmaceutical company in the country is in the world is trying to get into this, you would think that would drive the prices down, but not if they're paying zillions in licensing to make these products. I just wondered if that's an issue.
So I'm not sure I understand the core of the specific of your question.
I was just wondering whether it's very expensive to make monoclonal antibodies per se. I mean, if there's a lot of costs, if you have a newly designed monoclonal antibody, do you have to pay a lot of licensing fees to produce it because of the technology, IP that's in it?
Those patents have lapsed.
Uh-huh.
So that's, I think, not really an issue. Again, I think a lot of the pricing is what the market will bear, and I agree with Scott completely. It's, that's certainly going to change. I would say, though, that despite, people talk about the anti-PD-1 antibodies, they're about $150,000 a year. That is a lot of money. Although, I think if you were to compare the cost per benefit ratio with most of the chemotherapy drugs that were being developed in the 1980s and 90s, as a, per, patient year of life afforded, because the responders to immunotherapy, again, are measured in years, not months. They're, by that scale, a bargain. Prior to the dawn of immunotherapy, virtually no chemotherapeutic drug that was approved extended median survival for more than 6 months on average relative to the control arm. And at 4 years, the survival rates were absolutely no different than the control arm in the randomized trials. That's now changed.
That's really true, but it's also true that before the polio vaccine, nobody was free of the risk of polio, and sort of overnight, that was transformed and it was given away free. So, I mean, that's only one consideration. I mean, that is a serious, important consideration, but it's people like, isn't it also sort of social attitudes in science, I think, affect how industry looks at these issues, right? I mean, the views of people, influential people like you. Sorry to just throw that out.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think we all agree that My own feeling is that pricing should be tagged to benefit. And in cancer, there is no other disease in which the metrics of benefit in terms of months or years of remission, survival, can be measured with real clarity. There is now incredible imbalance in pricing relative to benefit. I personally, I don't know, again, where you set the scale is going to be a matter of negotiation, but I think it should be absolutely tied to benefit.
But it's not quite that black and white. It really isn't. I wish it were. Because there is this thing, and in the previous panel, there are enormous amounts of drug failure that are very expensive, that need to find their way into a pricing and reimbursement model. I'll just give you one example. A company I work for, I won't name the company or the drug, pursuing an autoimmune indication, right, in an area with a significant unmet need, and conducted 3 phase 3 trials, actually 4, $800 million, just in late phase drug development, and the trials were all negative, and the drug didn't get approved. How do you recoup? It goes back to your investment model, right? This is high risk, and it should be high reward. If you want to pursue an industry that's high risk, but you don't give a reward, you're not going to have an industry. And so I totally agree that we need to factor in, and I was the one that brought it up. We need to be more transparent. We need to figure out how we characterize and quantify value. But you've got to be able to price in failure and investing in people that swing for the fences. And the NIH does great, right, in funding early research. That's the highest risk there is. And then I think you transition from research into drug development, and there's still significant risk. So it's a great topic to debate, but it's not just as black and white as this benefit for this price.
Yeah, just a comment. I mean, I think that to a large extent, usually when people are talking about pharma pricing, they talk about failure. And just one point that I'd like to bring up is that it's more an issue about incentivizing further research, because that's already kind of lost. So the question I think that you have to have, if there's any issue about how the market might respond, is really almost going forward. How much innovation do you want to incentivize on the basis of the prior work that's actually been done? Because if everyone basically went bankrupt as a result of the drug failure that might have actually already occurred, then people wouldn't put any money into pharma at all. Yeah. So I think it's a little bit complex. Certainly I think that there are issues related to market failure and problems. And obviously the government's involved in this in many, many ways, not least of which the whole idea of patents is a government-approved monopoly, right? So you can make a few statements about how government could be involved, but for the most part, patents and a lot of these issues are meant as ways to incentivize innovation. Specifically to the issue of PD-1 and PD-L1 drug development, I agree with Drew. The original monoclonal antibody patent was from Stanford. It's expired long ago. More recently, I think with PD-1 and PD-L1, that came from Dana-Farber, if I'm not mistaken, Arlene Sharp and Rafi
actually,
Ahmed.
The PD-1 patent actually came from Suku Hanjo, who discovered PD-1. And the PD-L1, there are a bunch of patents. And in the end, none of them actually held up to the point where, I mean, there are now over 23 PD-1 pathway blocking antibodies.
Right. Yeah, if you go
in the clinic. And so I think the pricing on those antibodies is just going to be driven down by the market, because most of them have reasonably similar activity. And so pharma ultimately is going to have to get ahead by innovation, not by trying to use patent estates to block other pharma from doing this. It's really changing now such that speed and innovation is a much larger driver of market share than ownership of a patent estate that can block others. I mean, I can't think of any situation with all the checkpoints that are being blocked and all the sort of tier A checkpoints. There are at least 5 companies that are making antibodies against them.
No, actually, while we were here today, durvalumab got approved for bladder cancer, and that would be the 3rd agent that has an approval in relapsed bladder cancer at this point. And if I'm not mistaken, avelumab is also before the FDA, at least it was publicly announced, so that would be another one. Recently, there was a New England Journal article with pembrolizumab, and obviously
these are all blockers of this
PD-1 and
pathway.
PD-L1. So yeah, there's a lot out there, and you would think, at least based on prior research regarding generic medications, that when you have 4 or 5 market entrants, that actually does start leading to some level of price competition in a given field. And so this would be approval within a given indication. So there's certainly a possibility.
Do you have more questions? I'll ask one more if you go ahead.
There are a couple of other aspects of pharmacological development that I don't know how they fit into this equation, and I wonder if you can comment on them. One is, I think I've heard you say that speed of innovation is important because if Merck comes up with a treatment for this, Pfizer is going to come up with another very soon. And I'm wondering what the cost and benefit is to have Me Too research as opposed to truly independent research. And I'm also wondering how this all fits with what I read about the proportion of pharmaceutical company investment in marketing is as opposed to research. Anything you'd care to say about these?
Yeah, Marshall Angel, who's a former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, has a lot of criticism, I think, of this issue of Me Too research. And I think she has a lot of good points. From the public health standpoint, I can state that, at least at the NCI, our goal is actually to catalyze new research. And so we're trying to avoid situations where we end up funding something that industry or academia or some combination thereof is actually able to do on its own. To a large extent, what we're always looking to do is push that leading edge wherever it might go. But from the public health perspective, from another vantage point, I think that there is at least some benefit to having more than one player within a given market. And I think one of the best examples came out recently with Express Scripts, in which hepatitis C virus was actually, I guess, discussed. They were trying to negotiate with Gilead Sciences and another company, and it's outside my field, but essentially the only real reason why they were able to get a better price from one market player was because they had another option. And if you can't really negotiate if you have no options. So there certainly is I think a twofold way of looking at innovation. It's not in the mission of my organization, of the NCI, to do Me Too work. So I agree. I don't think it's necessarily what the public, should be spending its tax dollar on. But from an industry perspective, I could see some benefits, not only to the companies that are actually doing the work, but also to the broader public, since as taxpayers, we also pay for these medicines through Medicare, Medicaid, the VA, and even through our tax rebates or tax deductions that are associated with our health care.
Maybe just to add a slightly different perspective, purely from an industry lens, this is about how do you want to diversify the risk in your portfolio. And if you're working for a truly innovative company, I can remember going, maybe this was an answer also to your question earlier about how do you make these decisions. Any drug that was going to be developed that was going to run through the portfolio, the development team had to go to the governance committee, and there were 3 parameters that you would be judged against, and only 3. You were going to be first to market, you were going to be first in class, best in class, or best in disease. There wasn't a panel for a Me Too approach. And you had to show why you believed your biology. It was going to be first relative to the competition, or best relative to the class, the PD-L1s or the PD-1s, or best in disease, immuno-oncology. And that's how decisions were made. So again, it goes back to the business that you're in, the kind of investors you have, and how you want to diversify risk across your portfolio.
Do we want to wrap up now? Or? Okay, does anyone else have a question? Okay, I guess we'll finish then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.